Reflections, Chapter 9, Lesson 3, Winning Independence. What to know? How did the Americans win the Revolutionary War? Identify the major battles and campaigns of the Revolutionary War. Describe how individuals and other nations contributed to the war's outcome. Vocabulary on Quizlet, traitor. You are there. It is 1776 in New York City. Soot from the recent fire has blackened the buildings. You, your father, and others are outside cleaning up. A woman says to you sadly, "Did you hear about Nathan Hale? Such a brave man." "He was a spy on our side, right?" You ask her. "Oh yes," she replies. "When the fire started here, he was captured by the British. Just before he was hanged, he said, 'I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country.'" Brushing soot from his hands, your father says, "That man showed how brave we patriots can be." Revolutionary Heroes. During the Revolutionary War, Americans were grateful for the efforts of Nathan Hale and other brave patriots. In 1776, when George Washington asked for volunteers to spy on the British in New York City, Hale volunteered. Hale was following the British when they took control of New York City. A huge fire swept through the city, and as people fled, the British captured Hale. When they discovered he was a spy, they hanged him. The reports of his final words spread quickly, and Hale became a hero. At sea, John Paul Jones, an American Navy commander, battled larger and better equipped British ships. In one famous battle in the North Sea near Britain, the British asked Jones to surrender. He replied, "I have not yet begun to fight." Jones kept fighting until the British ship gave up. American women also won fame for their bravery during the war. Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay earned the name Molly Pitcher by carrying fresh water to American troops during the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey in 1778. When her husband was wounded, she took his place in battle, helping to load the cannons. Macaulay stayed beside the cannons for the rest of the battle. As word of the fight for freedom spread, more volunteers arrived. Tadeusz Kościuszko traveled from Poland to work for the Continental Army. He built walls for defense during the Battle of Saratoga, and he helped design the plans for a fort at West Point, New York. Without Kościuszko's help, the Army's defenses would have been much weaker. So what effect did he have on the Battle of Saratoga? Here is Kościuszko and Mary Macaulay, Molly Pitcher, and here's John Paul Jones. Major battles of the American Revolution. American colonies, British, Spanish, American victory, British victory. The War in the South. When the British government learned that the French had begun helping the Americans, British leaders shifted the fighting to the south. They had captured several cities in the north, including Philadelphia and New York City. The British hoped to defeat the Americans in the south before French ships and soldiers could arrive. The British knew that many loyalists lived in the south, and they hoped for loyalist support. British leaders also hoped to capture southern port cities. The fight would be easier for the British if their navy supplied them from the sea. Savannah, Georgia, was Britain's first target. Savannah, Georgia was Britain's first target. On November 25, 1778, about 3,500 British soldiers landed near the town. They quickly overwhelmed the American soldiers who were trying to protect Savannah. Early in 1780, the British moved north to capture Charlestown, later known as Charleston, in South Carolina. There, too, the Continental soldiers were greatly outnumbered and soon lost the battle. Early in 1781, Benedict Arnold, a former Continental Army officer, began leading British attacks on Virginia towns. Arnold had become a traitor, or someone who acts against his or her country. Earlier, he had decided to give the British the plans to the American fort at West Point, New York. However, the Americans discovered Arnold's plan before he could carry it out. Arnold began working for the British because he was not satisfied with his rank and his salary in the Continental Army. Although the Americans lost several battles to the British, they kept fighting. General Nathanael Greene, who led the Continental Army in the South, told his soldiers not to give up. He said, quote, "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again." Under Greene's leadership, General Daniel Morgan led the Americans to a major victory at Cowpens, South Carolina, in January 1781. The Battle of Cowpens was a turning point because it proved that American militia forces could defeat the British. The British Army then pushed into North Carolina. The Americans and British fought a fierce battle at Guilford Courthouse in March 1781. However, the British could not win the war or defeat the American spirit. Why did the British concentrate on the South? Victory at Yorktown. 1781, Yorktown, Virginia. By the summer of 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis had set up his headquarters at Yorktown, Virginia. Yorktown was on Chesapeake Bay, a location that made it easy for British ships to deliver supplies. However, Yorktown's location also meant that the town could be surrounded easily. Knowing this, the French and the Americans made a plan to defeat Cornwallis at Yorktown. Both French and Continental soldiers marched south to surrender Yorktown. At the same time, the French Navy took control of Chesapeake Bay. The British Navy could not get supplies to the British Army. General Cornwallis was trapped. In late September, he sent word to his commander in the north. If you cannot relieve me very soon, you must be prepared to hear the worst. The worst that Cornwallis warned about did happen. After being surrounded for weeks and under attack from both land and sea, Cornwallis surrendered. One person who was there wrote, quote, "At 2 o'clock in the evening, October 19th, 1781, the British Army, led by General Charles O'Hara, marched out of its lines with colors cased, flags folded, and drums beating a British march." French blockade. The French army kept British soldiers at Yorktown from getting supplies. Fighting in the trenches. Colonel Alexander Hamilton led a large group of American soldiers at Yorktown. Let's look at the Battle of Yorktown. The Battle of Yorktown was the last major battle of the Revolutionary War. Please look at pages 393 and 392 and locate these items on the map. Number 1, French soldiers. Number 2, American officers, headquarters. Number 3, American soldiers. 4, field where British surrendered. 5, British earthworks. 6, British soldiers. 7, Chesapeake Bay. 8, French ships. 9, British ships. 10, York River. Why were the British at a disadvantage in the Battle of Yorktown? How did the French contribute to the American victory at Yorktown? The Treaty of Paris. When word of Britain's surrender reached Philadelphia, the Liberty Bell rang out the news. The long fight was over. The Patriots had finally won their independence. The war had clearly been decided by the victory at Yorktown in 1781. However, the fighting dragged on in some places for more than 2 years. It was not until April 1782 that the British and Americans sent representatives to Paris, France, to negotiate a peace treaty. The American representatives, led by Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, stated the terms they wanted in the treaty. Britain had to agree to accept American independence and to remove all British soldiers from American lands. The British and American representatives talked with one another to work out an agreement. After a year of talks, the Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783, formally ending the war. The Treaty of Paris officially named the United States of America as a new country. It also set the new nation's borders. The United States would reach from Georgia in the south to the Great Lakes in the north. The Mississippi River would form its western border. After the Treaty of Paris was signed, George Washington returned home to Virginia, The war was over and British troops were leaving the United States. Washington no longer needed to lead the Continental Army. On his way home to Virginia, he stopped in Annapolis, Maryland, where Congress was meeting. This unfinished painting by Benjamin West shows, from left to right, John Jay, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin negotiating a peace treaty with British representatives in Paris. The negotiation led to the signing of the Treaty of Paris. At a meeting of Congress, Washington resigns from his position as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. So Washington told Congress that since the nation was now at peace, his work was done. He said, "Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action." He planned to return to his home and live a quiet life. So what were the effects of the Treaty of Paris? In summary, American heroes contributed to the war effort. The Americans won at Yorktown in the last important battle of the war. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris brought peace and formally declared the United States a new nation. How did the Americans win the Revolutionary War?